So if I told you, I want to make a monster disaster movie, but instead of focusing on the monster, I want to focus on the government response to the monster, what would you say to that? Because that movie is Shin Godzilla, aka Godzilla Resurgence. And I think it's an awesome movie. In fact, I liked it so much that I saw it twice in a row in the cinema and I decided to make this video about it. And this video is going to contain some mild spoilers, so if you want to go in fresh, here's my one sentence review. Shin Godzilla is a satirical, modern Japanese, post-Fukushima monster crisis management movie. And it's not going to be for everyone. Now, I know that some people are huge followers of the Godzilla franchise. I'm not one of those people. I haven't really watched the Japanese Godzilla films except for a few bits here and there, and my limited knowledge of the Japanese Godzilla or Gojira franchise has always been goofy movies about a giant lizard fighting a moth in a big rubber suit. As for the Hollywood Godzilla movies, watching the 1998 American Godzilla movie was quite possibly the first time I was old enough to realize that movies can be bad. And I thought the 2014 remake was good, but it made no lasting impression. But I was really excited after hearing about Shin Godzilla, because the film was co-directed and written by that beautiful man, Hideaki Anno, the writer-director of the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion. And if you are a long-time subscriber to this channel, you'll know that I love Evangelion. Shin Godzilla is a reboot of the Godzilla continuity, and based on initial trailers, I was looking forward to seeing Anno's trademark military otaku fetish for massive synchronized deployments of military hardware coupled with graceful set pieces of civic destruction and then harrowing, grotesque monster gore. And I got those things. In fact, in many ways, the movie feels like an extended version of the Operation Yashima storyline from Evangelion, where they harness Japan's entire electricity grid to shoot a giant floating diamond with a positron sniper rifle. The movie even features the same decisive battle music theme, courtesy of Evangelion series composer Shiro Sagisu. But what I did not expect from Shin Godzilla is that these action elements would take a backseat to what makes up the majority of the film. A dizzying and at times comical look at the social and political processes that are set lurching into motion by the appearance of a giant monster in Tokyo Bay. Shin Godzilla spends more screen time deploying photocopiers, laptops, prime ministers, documents, cabinet members, aides, and scientists than it does depicting the king of monsters. And at risk of being cliche, there are two monsters in Godzilla, the Kaiju itself and the lumbering Japanese government as it tries to balance the risks of evacuation, containment, military action, and bad PR. The movie introduces something like 100 characters, all with their own ambitions and weaknesses, and at times the film feels like a series of meetings with interchangeable bureaucrats and officials, to the point where you could argue that the film's characters are secondary compared to Anno's commitment to depicting chains of command and institutional structures. Other movies tend to be like this. There's a phone call. Mr. President, there's a giant monster. Send out the jets. Jump cut to the planes leaving the airbase, and then there's pew 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 pew. Shin Godzilla is more like, there's a phone call. Mr. Prime Minister, there's a giant monster. We need to have a cabinet meeting about the monster. Let's research the monster. We need to plan evacuation procedures because of the monster. We should probably have a press conference about the monster. Meanwhile, the monster is just tearing shit up. There are literally scenes in Shin Godzilla where the Prime Minister makes a decision, and then the movie rapidly jumps from the Prime Minister to the Defense Minister, to the General, to the Field Commanders, to the pilots, and then all the way back up the chain of command. Shin Godzilla is a darkly comic movie, but it's not flippant, because this is one of those science fiction movies which takes an unrealistic premise, like a giant monster appearing in Tokyo Bay, and then shows you a relatively realistic version of how things would play out in real life. In that way, it's somewhat similar to another one of my favorite movies, the 2011 Steven Soderbergh film Contagion, which depicts how the worldwide outbreak of a highly contagious virus would play out in actuality. While this attention to bureaucracy might understandably be boring or just bewildering if you just want to see people shoot the darn monster, it makes perfect sense as a classic science fiction film that takes an existing issue and then by introducing some fantastical element forces us to look at the issue from a new angle. Now, from what I understand, for the 1954 Godzilla, that issue was atomic bomb testing. In the 2016 remake, the issue is the 2011 tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And I think to enjoy this movie, you have to go into it with some awareness of this context. Otherwise, the focus of the whole movie will just seem bizarre. Now, I don't live in Japan, and I can't speak to how Japanese people might feel about Fukushima and the tsunami beyond what I've read and learnt about. But if you can remember back to the days of Fukushima, you can remember the sense of escalating panic as TEPCO and the Japanese government slowly released information about what was going wrong at the plant. And there was a lot of criticism at the time that officials were too slow to act and too cautious in sharing bad news with the public. You might have also heard about the Fukushima 50, a group of workers and volunteers who stayed behind to stabilize the nuclear reactors despite lethal radiation levels. And you can imagine the sheer tragedy of the thousands of people who died in the tsunami and the thousands of people who had to evacuate and relocate after their neighborhoods were just wiped off the map. Shin Godzilla is an analogy for this disaster. For most of the movie, Godzilla is just in the background, like some kind of unstoppable force of nature. It's like how the alien mothership just kind of looms in the background of District 9. It's just there, and you have to figure out a way to deal with it. It also makes the few scenes where Godzilla does wreak havoc all the more startling, because rather than just being, gratuitous destruction, it grounds the disaster in the real consequences of what something like this happening in a densely populated urban center would be like. The film also makes specific reference to Japan's particular post-World War II circumstances. Because of its role as an aggressor in World War II, modern-day Japan has a pacifist constitution that forbids it from waging offensive wars. So in the film, the government is unsure how to legally respond to a giant monster that technically flies no flag. There's a whole subplot in the movie about Japan requesting help from the US and the international community. And the antagonist in the film is almost as much the United States as it is Godzilla. And this seems to reflect the debate in Japan about their pacifist constitution and their status as basically a client state under the protection of the US military. Now, if you've watched the great 2006 South Korean monster movie, The Host, you'll notice that it actually has some similar themes. Incidentally, the worst parts of the film for me were probably all the scenes with Americans, because for some reason they all deliver their English lines horribly, awkwardly, like a Domino's CEO.
Have you heard of Hatsune Miku?
There's also this one Japanese actress who was clearly asked to deliver lines in English that she can't quite pull off, and it's just sort of really embarrassing for everyone involved. This film is very Japanese, and I don't mean Japanese in the kind of wacky panties in a vending machine way that Japan is often reduced to abroad. I mean that it's very Japanese in its concerns and commentary about Japan. It's an introspective look at society and institutional accountability in the face of terrible tragedy. And it's a collective call to action for all sectors of society to meet that tragedy with new ideas and steady persistence. And the film is apparently done very well in Japan. There's been some commentary that I've read about how the film is quite nationalistic and even radical in its message about Japanese politics. I can't really speak to that. But what I can say is this. Shin Godzilla is not a movie about mavericks and superheroes. It's not a film where some, everyday civilian saves the day by flying their plane into the mothership. At times, the film reads like a kind of bitter indictment of ineffectual and indecisive government, where you have scenes that are reminiscent of the council members squabbling in Akira. At other times, it acknowledges the need to act carefully and responsibly in crisis situations. Now, here's the bit where I'm sort of undecided, and maybe you can give me your own interpretation in the comments if you've seen the film. But after watching the film twice, I don't feel like the movie kind of plainly argues for some kind of fascist strongman approach that emphasizes action over humanity. Because the film shows government bureaucracy in this hyper-detailed fashion. And while this is part of the comic satire of the film, I think that Shin Godzilla also acknowledges that complex problems require complex solutions and they require consensus and cooperation. So even when some of the film's characters kind of dodder and hesitate, I think the movie respects the gravity of the life and death decisions they have to make. And surprisingly, for a film that basically contains no civilian characters, I feel like Shin Godzilla's fundamental sympathy is with the everyday people whose lives are impacted by disaster. That's my take anyway. I was stunned by how much I liked this film, in spite of, or probably because of, the interesting direction the directors chose to go. Because it's a comical and at times goofy monster movie that also tries to ask serious questions. And I think in that way it succeeds compared to a film like Captain America Civil War, which used political themes as clumsy window dressing. So I do really recommend you see Shin Godzilla, and if you have seen it, then leave a comment, since I'd love to know what you got out of this movie. And since this is sort of unusual content for this channel, let me know if you want to see more videos like this in the future, and click the like button if you do. Gojira! Ba, ba, bum, 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 bum.